as we all know, Esther is one of two books in the Bible that does not feature God or anything really religious. So why is the book of Esther in the canon? To answer that question, we are going to look at three components of the book of Esther. One, Esther as an Old Testament type foreshadowing Jesus Christ in the New Testament. Two, Esther is a book that relays important aspects of the book of Daniel, and in turn we see how Revelation relays important aspects of the book of Esther. And three, Esther as going a little bit further than Daniel and Revelation in providing complementary insight as to end-time events. So let's look at the first one. Esther is a type of Christ. Understand typology, that's the word, type or typology. To understand the import of the word, let's look at it. Typology is the art of finding paradigms, models, patterns or types, as we say in the Old Testament, which find their replica and ultimate fulfillment in the New Testament. In fact, ultimate fulfillment in the life, ministry, and when I say life, I mean life, death, resurrection, and ministry of Jesus Christ, as well as his second coming. Included are testimonies and anything that deals with the church or church customs and rites linked to our Lord Jesus Christ. Now, types can be exhibited by persons, places, things, institutions, events, actions, offices, or even object lessons. There are, when you compare the book of Esther and look for types and relate it to the life of Jesus Christ, these I have listed here a few. There are many, but let's look at a few here. How we connect the Old Testament Esther with the New Testament Jesus Christ. The interface between Herod and Jesus is but the historical fulfillment of an archetypal feud between Jacob and Edom, that is Esau. We all know this archetypal battle, if you want, or struggle between Jacob and his brother Esau, also known as Edom. This archetypal feud is relayed by the encounter of Moses and the Amalekites at the Battle of Rephidim, then by the tribe of Simeon and the inhabitants of Mount Seir, followed by the encounter between Saul and King Agag, then David and the Amalekites, and then Esther and Haman, and finally the Jews and the sons of Haman. So the encounter of Jesus Christ with Herod is just but one in that relay of that archetypal feud that started between Jacob and Esau. Now, the most telling type is the sacrifice of Esther. We all know that Esther sacrifices her life to save her people, the Jewish people. And Jesus Christ picks up on that. Jesus says, "No one takes my life." And to a certain extent, he echoes the words of Esther when Esther says, "If I perish, I perish." Then you have the three-day fast that Esther goes through, as well as the Jewish people in the capital called Shushan. And those 3-day fast of Esther correspond to the 3 days of Jesus in the tomb. Then you have other motifs. They are typical or typological or typal motifs that we find. For example, the scapegoat motif. Haman, if you want, scapegoats the Jews in the same way as later we find in the New Testament, Jesus Christ, quote unquote, is a scapegoat for the sinners. And we all know that this scapegoat motif is attached to another scapegoat motif, which is the cross itself. Now, Esther laments the fate of her people and weeps at the feet of Xerxes. We know that in the second time she presents herself to Xerxes. And that prefigures Jesus Christ, weeping for Jerusalem and for the children as well as the women of Jerusalem. You know that part already, that episode. A most powerful replay, in fact, a most powerful really type in him is Haman prostrated at the feet of Esther. If you remember, you find Haman prostrating himself at the feet of Esther on the bed where Esther was. And this is a mirror image, if you want, of the prophecy of Genesis 3:15, "He will crush your head and you will bruise his heel." The description of the royal palace of Shushan uses the very same words in Esther to describe the temple in Jerusalem, from outer court to inner court, the holy place and the most Holy of Holies, or the most holy place. If you look at the ascent of Esther from the outer court as she walks towards the king, King Xerxes, it's similar to, if you want, the progression of the high priest during Yom Kippur. You have here like a prefiguring of the procession of Jesus from priestly court to Calvary, to heavenly holy place, and eventually to the heavenly most holy place. Then we have Jesus' words, where Jesus says, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son." The word "whosoever," you find it replicated, or rather typed, in Esther. And it replicates the salvation for all, universality of salvation, as we find it in Esther 9:27. The Jews established and imposed it, meaning the celebration of the Feast of Purim, upon themselves and their descendants. And Esther says, "and all who would join them." All meaning all non-Jews. And Esther makes salvation universal. Esther, if you want, opens the salvo of the offer of universal salvation that prefigures Jesus' offer. And Jesus himself says, "Many will come from east and west and sit down with Abraham," apparently overturned after some time, because the Jews didn't follow up on that, as we know. In fact, Jesus succeeded where Esther failed. Then you have the edict to annihilate all Jews, pointing to the ultimate decree, backed by a confederacy of Antichrist's forces in the end time to eliminate commandment keepers, and we all are accustomed to that. The reason is the same, is the observance of the law. The observance of the law. Jesus' claim of Haman that the Jews have laws different from the Persians, in doing so we see that therefore the Jews need to be eliminated. The Jews are to be eliminated according to Haman. And Jesus Christ picks up or responds, if you want, to that by saying the law, not even a tilt, will pass away. Then you have Esther as a type of the Church of Christ, where ultimate leadership is devolved to men, even if women could be playing a more important role. Esther seizes the reign from the hands of Mordecai to deliver the Jews, and afterwards relinquishes the leadership and the credit to Mordecai. And finally, that's one of many, that's the 12 I have here, Purim, the Feast of Purim, is but a type of the Holy Communion or emblems. And developing this will take another presentation, really. Then we have Esther, that Esther relays the book of Daniel as much as Revelation relays the book of Esther. Might appear new to you, but this is what we have found. Daniel and Revelation, as you know, are prophetic. That is God's instruction for the end time in the form of words delivered by God, the word of God. Esther is equally prophetic. That is, it is God's instruction for the end time, but not in word form, but in action form. That's what makes it typology as opposed to prophecy. That's why we label it typology. Now let's look at Daniel. If you compare Daniel 9, the famous 70-week prophecy, 70 days if you want, or 70 weeks prophecy pointing to the first advent of the Messiah. Let's look at it. Daniel uses the 1 day, 1 year interpretation principle for the time prophecies given to us in the word form. But in Esther, you meet a different kind, if you want, of what we call typology. It's not word form, but it is, if you want, event form. And the principle here is the use of a 1 day, 7 years principle. And again, it's a mirror image of her supposedly one night that she was supposed to spend with the king, as you remember. She was supposed to spend one night, but in fact she stayed on the throne of Persia for 7 years. This is where we find this typological principle of 1 day is equivalent to 7 years. When applied to the timeline, starting with the date of the proclamation of the edict to kill the Jews on Nisan 13, 474 BC, and that timeline was supposed to end, or if you want, you look at the ending of that timeline we're looking at, which is Sivan 23rd, the third month or religious month of the Jews, 474 BC. We have, if we count the number of days, you find out that there are 72 days. Now, if you apply this principle of 1 day is 7 years, you find out that 72 days is 504 years. And what is interesting is when you apply it, if the starting point of that timeline of 504 days or years, if you want, if the starting point is 474 BC, the end is 31 AD. And you all know what happened in 31 AD. It is the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. Now, if we compare with Daniel 8:14, you know the 2,300 mornings and evenings prophecy. And as we develop that, we find out that it ends, the timeline ends in 1844, and especially with the cleansing of the sanctuary, the heavenly sanctuary. Now, we see the very same thing in the book of Esther. The timeline in Esther starts with Nisan the 13th, 474 BC, and ends on Adar 13th, 473 BC. And you look at the timeline and you find out that there are 331 days. Now, if you apply the principle of 1 day is 7 years, now we get 2,317 years of historic timeline. If the starting point of that timeline in Esther is 473 BC, you find out that the end point is 1844, similar to Daniel. The beginning of the end times leading to the second coming. Now, you might ask me, where does that come from? But we have said that in Esther itself, the fact that she stays on the throne 7 years when in fact she was supposed to spend 1 day or 1 night with the king, this is where we get this analogy, if you want. Now, for those who want deeper study, you can find the most powerful analogy of this when you look at the 1 day 7 years principle and the 1 day 1 year principle. When you compare those two with the Sabbath of days, the Sabbath of years, and what we call the Sabbath of sabbatical years. Now, let's look at Revelation 13. In Revelation 13, we see the Antichrist forces, and in Esther, we see Haman and his sons. They both, if you want, these two, the Haman and his 10 sons, they constitute the type of the confederacy of Antichrist forces personified by the first beast in Revelation 13. Xerxes, the Persian king and husband of Esther, typifies the second beast. Xerxes commands that Haman be worshipped as a god. The second beast of Revelation 13 makes an image to the first and commands that it be worshipped equally. Failure to obey in Esther leads to the edict to annihilate the Jews. Failure to obey in Revelation 13 leads to an edict to kill dissenters. Now, we look at Esther, and we see that Esther foreshadows and forecasts the final days. The prophetic timelines in Daniel and Revelation, they both stop at 1844, as we all know. But the calendar of events in Esther does not stop at Adar 13, or if you want, 1844. The events, or the event that we see in Esther, can highlight, if we understand clearly the events after, quote-unquote, Adar 13 in Esther, we can have a little glimpse of what could happen in the end, the sequence of events in the end that we don't find, to a certain extent, in Daniel and in Revelation. We have an extra glimpse, if you want, at the sequence of events in the end. Let's look at a few. The Adar 13, 474, that's the day when Xerxes distances himself from Esther. Esther says that 30 days before, that she, to a certain extent, she had fallen out of favor from Xerxes because Xerxes had not invited her to his bed. So we find here in the Adar 13, 474, that date, if you want, is the equivalent of, if you want, the birth of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. It's the day. It was supposed to be the day in the Adar 13, 473, 1 year later, which is going to be, or which was, the deliverance of the Jews. It corresponds to the opening salvo of the end times. That is the birth of the Seventh-day Adventist Church in 1844. Then you have another aspect in Esther that we call the Shabbat Shekalim, that the Jews had to go through while they were waiting to be killed by their enemies. They went during that special month called the month of Adar. There's a Shabbat, the first Shabbat of that month is called the Shabbat Shekalim, the first Sabbath during the month of Adar. And it was observed to redeem all males by collecting a special sanctuary tax. And that tax was to be sent to Jerusalem. This particular event corresponds to principles of tithing and free will offerings that were accepted in the Adventist Church just after 1844, just before the church was going to be organized. And as you all know, the church was officially organized in 1863. Then during that month, again, prefiguring the end times, was a Shabbat or a Shabbat called Shabbat Zakor. And that Zakor in Hebrew means to remember. The Jews at that time, they were supposed to remember how Amalek attacked the rear of the Israelites' armies, or if you want, the children of Israel as they left Egypt and as they entered into the desert of Sinai. So if you want this Shabbat Zakor, meaning remember that day when the Amalekites attacked you. Remember, Zakor. And that became, if you want, a type of what of what the Seventh-day Adventists did after they had discovered that Christ was not coming in 1844. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. And as you know, the Adventists really officialized the keeping, to a certain extent, the keeping of the seventh-day Sabbath, the Saturday Sabbath. Now you've got another Sabbath following that called the Shabbat Para. It's the Sabbath of the red heifer purification water. Some of you are very familiar with that. Well, this, in the development of the Adventist Church, it corresponds to the cleansing or the finding of the cleansing of the heavenly sanctuary, or what we call the investigative judgment, as the Adventists understood it in 1844 and later. And then we have the Shabbat Hagadol. It's called the large, big, or important, or great Sabbath. It's the Sabbath that precedes, if you want, Passover, which is Nisan the 13th. It commemorates the setting aside of the Paschal Lamb. The observance of the Shabbat Hagadol by the Jews who were there in distress, this typifies the acceptance of the justification by faith, the doctrine of the justification by faith that the Adventists ultimately adopted. Now, if you look at Esther 3:1, Xerxes promotes Haman. The second beast of Revelation 13 promotes the first beast, as we know, and as understood by Adventists today. It is the United States promoting the Antichristic or Antichrist system. And as Xerxes advances Haman, so the US also advances the Antichrist system. And as Xerxes sets Haman's seat above all the princes in the book of Esther, so the United States makes the Antichrist system the masterpiece broker of the world. And these days, this is what we are seeing in front of our very own eyes. Then you have Xerxes. He commands his servants to bow down to Haman. And that corresponds to the United States making an image of the Antichrist system, looking like the Antichristic system, which is in fact the beginning of the fall of the First Amendment of the US Constitution. Well, all this, the protection of religious freedom of individuals, as you know, have already started to be eroded in the Constitution in the United States. Then you have Xerxes. He commands not only bowing to Haman, but paying him homage, as if he's a god. And this corresponds to the US passing Sunday laws. The authority to change the Decalogue is what undergirds the Antichristic system. This event coincides with the passage of the investigative judgment in the heavenly sanctuary from dead believers to living believers, as we all know. It is the beginning of the mild version of the time of trouble for Saturday Sabbath keepers. As the Jews sought relief from Haman's edict, so do Saturday Sabbath keepers seek relief from Sunday laws, using the law courts, for example, as we are already doing, especially for our students who have to sit for exams on Sabbath. The success of Sabbath keepers coincides with mass conversion of Gentiles as in the time of Esther. This is something interesting that we find in the book of Esther, this mass conversion of non-Jews. They become Jews overnight. And we see and we expect, let's put it this way, in terms of typology, this is what we can expect for us in the last days. The success of Sabbath keepers will coincide with mass conversion of Gentiles as in the time of Esther. What I mean by success of Sabbath keepers will eventually also probably obtain a counter edict that will relieve them for a while from their trouble. Then you have, similar to the sons of Haman, as you know, the sons of Haman maintained the edict alive, even if their father was dead. And to the same extent, even if we as Seventh-day Adventists, Sabbath keepers, or Saturday Sabbath keepers, commandment keepers, even if we obtain relief, still there is pressure eventually one day to annihilate all commandment keepers. The Antichrist Confederacy and the US come up, of course, with an edict to wipe out all commandment keepers. And when the edict is enforced, the severe version of the time of trouble will arrive. Reminder of Jacob's struggle, again, with the angel, but he thought he was struggling with Edom, with Esau, his brother. And again, this is an archetypal battle. Then on Adar 13 is the deliverance of the Jews in the book of Esther. And this, of course, is equated with the coming of Christ. And the first, if you want, the first, what we call Purim 1, the first day when the deliverance was celebrated, called Purim 1, Purim 1 becomes the super type of the marriage supper of the Lamb, followed by the millennium. And then you have Purim 2, that's the second day of the celebration of the victory of the Jews over their enemies. And Purim 2 becomes the super type of the final battle and celebration of the victory of Christ over evil. In conclusion, we can refer to Esther first. As you know, Esther had offered her estate, complete with enclosed Persian gardens. As you know, she had inherited all the estate of Haman, and the estate was full of gardens that we call in Persian paradisa, or paradise. And Esther had protected the Jews by offering her own property, her own estate, and the gardens to protect the Jews of Shushan. In the same way, Jesus has gone to prepare a paradise for his people. As no Jew lost their lives to their enemies on Adar 13, so is the promise of Jesus that not a hair of believers will be lost at the final showdown preceding his coming. Therefore, there is no doubt that the ultimate manifestation of God through the triumph of the Jews will again be repeated in the end times, in the midst of his apparent absence, in the midst of his deafening silence, even death, as some have proclaimed, the death of God. But in reality, we will see the ultimate triumph of Christ-like people worldwide. In the meantime, as the Jews lived in between imminent death and lifelong hope, so Esther teaches us to hit the right balance between the already and the not yet, between Christ's imminent appearance and unending delays. Amen.